Seven, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Welcome back to History with Jackson. I'm your host, Jackson Van Uden, and you are listening to the podcast where we speak to historians every week about their latest work. Now, if you enjoyed this episode or any other episodes that we create here, please do consider heading to our Patreon or History Jackson Plus on Apple Podcasts, where you can get your episodes ad-free and a week early. Now, without further ado, let's jump into the episode. Hello and welcome back to the History with Jackson podcast. And today we welcome back author, historian, friend, Jack Bowsher. How you doing, Jack?
Yeah, I'm brilliant, Jackson. Thank you so much for having me back on. You know, it's it's been almost a year now since you had me on for Forgotten Armour. So really, really exciting to see how much we've gone on as well. You know, we spent a couple of weeks ago we did the Imperial War Museum Festival. That was really good fun. So it's nice we keep catching up at each other with these different festivals.
Yeah, I think it's been 2 or 3 times since over the last year at different festivals. So it's been really, really fun. And it's nice to finally to finish the story that we started with Forgotten Armour, Tank Warfare in Burma, with Thunder Run, Meiktila Run, 1945, the greatest combined arms manoeuvre battle of World War II. Another great cover as well.
Yes, my very, very brave tagline there to try and cause a little bit of debate. Yeah, but I will try and defend it. We'll see what the readers think. But yeah, no, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about what inspired you to write this book, because the other one Forgotten Armour came out of your master's dissertation. What made you want to write this one about the Thunder Run in 45?
Yeah. I mean, this is funny in the introduction. I think Vladimir Putin at one point, because he has a role in it. Because when I was doing that master's dissertation, I was reading about the Thunder Run to Baghdad in 2003. That's the inspiration for the name, the 2003 Iraq thing. But it was at the same time that Putin invaded Ukraine, and he sent a similar concept of a fast-moving ground offensive on a very narrow front to try and capture Kyiv from southern Belarus, charging south. And they got it wrong, and there were loads of fundamentals that Putin got wrong, the Russians got wrong, and that allowed the Ukrainians to hold them off in the villages to the north. And it didn't work. And listeners may remember there were all those news stories of tailbacks of supply vehicles, loads of stuff going wrong with them. Then they've been picked up by drones and missiles and artillery and all that sort of thing. And so I was looking at what went right for 2003. We were seeing what was going wrong in 2022. And I was doing the reading for my master's dissertation, where this operation to capture Meiktila in 1945 also came up. And so sort of this perfect storm of these three different angles all came together. And I was like, when I finished the dissertation I did Forgotten Armour, I then had so much fun writing about this particular episode. I was like, that's the next book. I've got to do that for the next book. And it's been one of the best sort of things I think I've ever done in terms of enjoyment, you know, because it's just such a good story. And nobody knows anything about it. That's the amazing thing. There's so little has been written on it. There's one or two little things, but you know, just nothing of any real substance. And this is one that I really lovingly put together. There's loads of really good eyewitness accounts in there that, again, most people have never seen the light of day, that I've managed to sort of hunt down and find. And that's what I hope people will get to it. Apart from the combined arms maneuver warfare, you know, it's not just the Germans that do that. It's not just Patton. You know, I put on the cover, like the back cover, you know, if Patton or Zhukov or Guderian or Rommel or whoever, or Monty had done this operation, it would be completely world famous. We wouldn't hear the end of it. But because it happens in Burma, no one knows anything about it. And yet it's just a wonderful, wonderful military piece of the military art.
I think that leads me on to the kind of next question then. Why do you think we tend to forget what's going off in Burma and not really connect it to the wider war?
The biggest one by far is definitely that proximity. You know, the goings on in Burma is not going to lead to an invasion of the British Isles, Great Britain. And so that is a really big thing that removes it from the consciousness of the ordinary British public. You know, the size of the British army that fights against Germany is much larger. You know, if you look at the fighting in Burma, about 85% of the soldiers are Indian soldiers. And the 15% that is made up of other, you know, the British are about 100,000 soldiers. You know, you've got 100,000 African, that sort of thing. So it's really quite small numbers in comparison to the millions that fight in the Western theatres, millions of British soldiers. That's by far the most obvious thing, or those couple of things. So there's not the exposure for families receiving letters from the front. Most families are receiving letters from North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, not Burma, just if you took the whole population of Great Britain. And they're not under threat. So those are sort of the two main ones. But the other thing I think is just the fact that with the war in Japan, it's seen as an American show anyway. What's so sort of the big thing that's forgotten about it is the Burma campaign is about making sure China stays in the war. Because if China loses the Second World War to Japan, and you've then got to imagine all of those Japanese soldiers, like 1.5 million Japanese soldiers, would then be available to fight in the Pacific War against America to defend the home islands. If the atomic bombs hadn't happened, remember, in terms of planning phases, remember, very, very few people know about the atomic bombs. So keeping China in the war is a really, really important priority. But again, it's just that extra remove from people back home in Britain. And then you've got all the really big people, I mentioned, Zhukov, Patton, Rommel, and all those things. There are just bigger names doing operations in Europe compared to what's going on in Burma. And all of those reasons are linked, but I think that's really it.
It's always really interesting to hear the different reasons why wars are going on, and particularly the importance of keeping the Chinese in this war, because we don't often think about the Chinese role in World War II. But then you're talking about leaders. Who is leading this operation in Burma?
Yeah, so, the Meiktila operation is part of the reconquest or the liberation of Burma. And I do like to say liberation on the basis that whilst the Japanese arrived in Burma thinking that they were acting as liberators, they don't really have that much intention. They're acting as liberators for the Burmese until they've got what they want from the local Burmese, and then they treat them like any other colonial power has ever treated them. No different to the British, treating the Burmese. All empires by definition are effectively exploitative at heart. Whatever other negatives and pros there are, ultimately they're about the mother country receiving a benefit. Otherwise, why the hell would they do it? What you get, though, is that the Japanese sour the relationship with the Burmese incredibly quickly. So you have them taking advantage within months of the end of the war. So by the time you get to 1945, 3 years later, when the British are coming back into Burma, a lot of Burmese are willing to support that. And so that will have a big impact on this operation. Sim then invades Burma. And when the reason I was saying that, is because by 1945, many of the population have switched sides because they've seen what Japanese imperialism is, and they're kind of like, well, we don't want either, so we'll go with the next guy that's kicking that guy out, that kind of thing. But anyway, so Slim's reinvasion, liberation, reconquest, whatever you want to call it, of Burma, is sort of twofold. There's the original intention to just destroy the Japanese on the central dry belt, but then there's the subsidiary operations by all of the different actual commanders. So it's Slim's operation to liberate Burma. Then there's the 4th Corps. So there's 2 corps, 33rd and 4th, in Burma at the time. And 33rd, I'm slightly simplifying, there are other units as well, but the main central part of this narrative is these two very large units of 3 divisions each. 33 Corps doing the northern operations. They're going for a place called Mandalay, which most people probably heard of. 4 Corps is sent to capture Meiktila through like a secret operation. And they're under the command of General Frank Messervy. Now, he's very famous for his role at things like the Battle of the Admin Box. There's the rumour that the legend that he was fighting at one point in his pyjamas, although it's probably not true because there are a number of eyewitnesses that see him not in his pyjamas after the first sort of half an hour when that fight starts. So he only spends a little bit. But generally speaking, he is not found wandering the jungle in his pyjamas like the legend suggests. Anyway, he's commanding the 4th Corps on this secret operation to cross the big Irrawaddy River, which is the big defensive line that the Japanese have chosen to defend, to try and outflank basically most of the Japanese. The big problem that happened at the beginning of this period is when Slim first invades Burma after the battles of Imphal and Kohima, sort of a few months after those battles, Slim just assumes they're going to fight tooth and nail for every single inch of Burma, and they don't. What they do is they retreat behind the Irrawaddy River, which is 3 times as wide as the Rhine in the area that we're talking. So, we talk about comparisons with Europe. The Irrawaddy is much wider than the Rhine, but no one ever thinks about the crossing of the Irrawaddy. And it's a huge operation, but it's really, really improvised because they don't have all of the same kit that the Europeans have. Now, the crossing of the Rhine is the culmination of sort of amphibious or riverine amphibious warfare. The Irrawaddy, they're chopping down teak forests to make their own barges, and they're putting Bailey Bridge sections on top of pontoons and this sort of thing, and canvas collapsible boats rather than landing craft to make the crossings. But they're crossing the Irrawaddy because the Japanese have chosen to defend it rather than fight tooth and nail for the central dry belt. Now, this central dry belt in Burma, we always think of Burma as being all jungles, but it isn't. It's all about, it's a very, very geographically diverse place, like it is ethnically diverse as well. But the thing is, Slim's advantages by 1945 are power, artillery, tanks, mechanized maneuver, which he's kind of added to the army at the end of 1944, knowing that there's the central dry belt they've got to attack. And his really big plan is very Nelsonian. I've compared it to Nelson quite a lot. He is not going into Burma to capture territory so that we can say, a bit like the phase line debate in Normandy. They're not going into Burma to take X place, Y place, and all this sort of thing, because that's really great. We own this territory or whatever. They are deliberately acting to annihilate the Japanese army in Burma. And they want to do it in the central dry belt because that's where his tanks, artillery, air power, maneuver warfare, etc., have the advantage. If they allow the Japanese to retreat into southern Burma, the jungles and so on, that will give the advantage back to the light infantry ambushing bunker warfare that the Japanese want to fight. And it will make the reconquest, the liberation of Burma much, much more difficult. Now, the problem is because the Japanese commander, a guy called Hataro Kimura, he has retreated behind the Irrawaddy, that is really, really difficult because it suggests the Japanese are not going to do, fight tooth and nail, which is why Messervy has led 4 Corps down a secret valley, the Gangor Valley, through thick jungle, radio silence, lots of deception operations going on to make the Japanese think that the other corps, the 3rd Corps in the north, going for Mandalay, is the main effort. And that's really supposed to be like a honey trap for the Japanese. It's supposed to be really obvious the British are going for, and the Indians are going for Mandalay. The Japanese will send reinforcements to Mandalay. Meanwhile, to the south, this secret advance will pop out the jungle 100 miles, 90 miles to the south, cross the Irrawaddy suddenly, and then send a thunder run, which is my modern phrase, by the way. They don't say that. I've added that retrospectively because of the similarities. But they will charge across and capture this town of Meiktila at the bottom of the central dry belt, thus trapping all of those troops that have rushed to Mandalay where they are. And remember, Slim is here to destroy them, not to take territory. Okay, and so therefore he will then have that battle, and the soldiers at Mandalay and the soldiers at Meiktila, 90 miles to the south, they will then squeeze the Japanese between the two of them and destroy them. Once they've destroyed them, the road to Rangoon will basically be open, another 400 miles to the south, but through thick jungle for much of that journey. Again, he doesn't want the Japanese to defend that thick jungle. He wants them destroyed before they even go into that jungle. The whole point of these operations. And they need to get to Rangoon, because this is the other complicating factor. There's a ticking clock for this as well. They need to get to Rangoon before the monsoon, because if the monsoon strikes before they've got to Rangoon and its ports, that's the crucial thing here, they will not be able to maintain their army on the central dry belt or the jungles of southern Burma to the north of Rangoon over a land supply route. And because the monsoon, the aerial supply route won't work either. They need Rangoon so they can open the port and bring supplies in that way. Don't capture Rangoon by mid-May, okay, you might ultimately have to retreat back into India, potentially. They probably would have fudged it slightly and stayed in northern Burma, but it would have been really, really difficult. Basically nobody wants that. So they're desperate to destroy the Japanese in the central dry belt, then get to Rangoon with as little opposition as possible before the monsoon, if they can manage it.
And trying to manage all these factors within an invasion and an attack seems to be quite a lot to stay on top of. For the Japanese as well, I found their reaction and their response to the British to be quite confusing. It felt like there wasn't a lot of joined up thinking in how they would respond to the British, how they would supply themselves, and what the actual plan was.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing, it's interesting you say about how they're going to supply themselves. The big reason for going to Meiktila, which is not, even then it was a bit of a sort of an industrial, semi-industrial sort of transport hub, backwater place. The reason it's important is because the railway, canals, and roads all roughly pass through it to get to the north. And so by capturing Meiktila, that's something the Japanese have to take back to keep feeding and supplying their army, which is part of the beauty of the selection of Meiktila as the town they're going to attack and capture. And the thing we haven't mentioned is that when this is done, when Mesavie sends this division and a tank brigade to capture Meiktila, they're not capturing it as territory. They're going as 3,000 vehicles, a division and a tank brigade. They're capturing it and then being surrounded 80, 90 miles behind Japanese lines, being supplied 100% by air. And then they're going to let the Japanese attack them, and they will kill them as they attack them, is the idea. And that's that confused thinking with the supplies, because the Japanese have to take Meiktila back, otherwise they're cut off from their supplies. Now, to a degree, their supply system can bend around that, but it's for extra friction, to use that Clausewitzian sort of idea. There's more friction than necessary now, because they're having to bend their supply system. But the other thing he said is the confusion of it. There is, it's one of these things where you just can't believe it. There is one point, and I mentioned this in the book, where the Japanese say, we've seen some vehicles heading for Meiktila, but because it doesn't seem likely, we're going to ignore it. It's wild. There's 3,000 vehicles charging across the desert to Meiktila, and they're like, well, it's probably, like, we don't think that the British would do that, so we're going to ignore it. And it takes another 3 or 4 days before they go, oh yeah, actually there is something going on. And then they actually start to send reinforcements from the north down to attack it. It's absolutely wild. Like, literally, there's a direct quote in there from a guy who was captured after the war, interviewed by the Americans. So he's interviewed right after the war, and he says, it's literally like, oh, we took no account of it because it was unlikely. Wow.
It was just absolutely bizarre reading these Japanese responses. And I was absolutely flabbergasted at why they didn't do certain things, why they responded in a certain way, and the way they communicated with one another.
Yeah, like the other one is they have there are two Japanese divisions who are sent to attack. One of them is probably Kimura's best, the 18th Division, but they have been mauled. They're probably at half strength, about 10,000 men. They're a very experienced unit. The commander is experienced. He is sent south. He is given all of the extra artillery from 15th Army, this thing called Naganuma Force. So he doesn't just have his ordinary divisional artillery. He has all this siege artillery as well, like 105mm, 150mm artillery, as well as the normal stuff they have, and a load more on top. And they get some reinforcements from 53rd Division as well, called Sakuma Force. So 18th Division has all these extra bits bolted onto it to kind of bring it up to a bit more strength, and it's experienced. To the south, there's the 49th Division, which is completely green. They've never fought a battle in this war. Now, they had only just arrived. They're basically newly raised, and they're sent north. And they're going to crush Meiktila from two sides. But again, Kimura, 15th Army Commander Nakamura, they don't actually say which of the two divisional commanders is in charge of the operation. And maybe there's a hindsight here, but I don't think it is hindsight. It's surely obvious that you're going to give the really experienced commander and division operational command over the 49th Division, which is completely inexperienced. And 18th Division has all the extra assets that have been bolted onto it. Surely it's obvious they're going to have command. But no, what they're doing is basically you two just need to coordinate. And then they're left to get on with it. And part of this is because, one thing we're slightly not giving the Japanese credit for is Slim's deception plans for both of these two operations, the one to the north at Mandalay, and Meiktila, that's the focus of my book and stuff. And don't get me wrong, I'd love to do a book on the Mandalay operation, because the guy in charge of the capture there, Pete Rees, is an absolute legend. He's probably my favourite commander of the war. But that's another book. That's another interview. What I want to do is, what I want to see is the operation for deceiving the Japanese is what we need to kind of see as another part of the Japanese confusion, because they are completely sucked into that battle at Mandalay. And it's this inertia of like having to go through the fact of, oh my God, Mandalay's under attack. Then it's got to be, look, there's another operation, but it's probably just a raid. Then they've got to go through, this Mandalay operation is not going well, and that one to the south is looking quite serious as well, too. Oh my God, our supplies are cut off. or near enough cut off. So we're going to need to do something. We'll just send a couple of divisions there. And then it's like, yeah, we probably should unify that command as well, because that battle is also now going badly for us as well. So eventually, halfway through the battle, they reassign Masaki Honda, who was commanding further north up, fighting the Japanese, the not 28th Army, the 33rd Army. He is sent south to now take operational command of those two divisions. And that's probably the moment of greatest drama as well, because he's like, he notices very, very obviously that the whole operation at Meiktila is surviving on aerial resupply in the airfield. So he's then like, yeah, okay, we're going to concentrate, just shut down the airfield with artillery and raiding and infiltration. Shut down the airfield, they'll eventually be cut. That cuts them off. And so really the last part of the battle really is focused on keeping the air, or trying to close the airfield. But again, we've kind of skipped to the end in a weird way here. We haven't really done any of the rest of it. But that's kind of the command system that goes on. You go from nothing serious, probably not likely, to crap, we've got to do something about it, to let's concentrate on the airfield because that's the best hope of doing it. That's the command timeline, if you see what I mean, for the Japanese. But they are sucked in by all the deception operations until it's kind of getting too late.
I can kind of understand getting sucked into all the different things going off, because it is a very clever deceptive play. You mentioned towards the end there's a siege, the Japanese siege in Meiktila. There's a battle for the runway. But how do the British and the Indian troops actually capture Meiktila?
Yes, yeah. So that's where the Thunder Run comes in first, and that opening confusion there, where the Japanese are like, yeah, it's probably not likely. They think it's a raid. But like I said, it's 3,000 vehicles. This is not a small operation, and a division and a tank brigade charging across this desert. So the first thing is speed. It is all about striking the Japanese as hard as they can, as fast as they can, before they can organise. And so they go out across the desert. They have a couple of sharp scraps. The big ones at Oyin, which is a particularly bitter battle. They have a real lesson here in how far the Japanese suicidal tactics are to destroy a tank in particular. Because the big thing about the war in Far East in Burma, in the Burma campaign, is the Japanese never really develop anti-tank weapons or techniques that are effective, like properly effective, against Allied armour. So they can just about destroy a Stuart tank with their weapons. But by the time the M3 Lees and Grants come by beginning of 1944, and unless they're ambushing from fairly close range at the side or the rear, they generally can't destroy them with their anti-tank weapons. And therefore the same for the Sherman, because that's another upgrade up on the Grants and the Lees. So you have this thing where they have to develop other methods. So like the classic thing is the Molotov cocktail, the firebombing them with that sort of thing. That is used from 1942. The Japanese already have that. But by 1945, they're so desperate, they have now fully trained tank hunting parties. I suppose that's true earlier. They did have tank hunting infantry before that. But by 1945, there is an expectation that they won't come back. At the beginning of the war, they are very dangerous, but they are trained to get back alive. Whereas by 1945, they are literally charging a tank and jumping underneath it as a suicide bomber, which didn't generally happen in 1944, 1943, 1942. 1945, suicide bombers. And so you get these moments at this battle at Oyin, the first time they really face this, where a guy like literally runs out with his bomb clutched like a rugby ball. And Jackson, I know you're a big rugby fan. The guys, the infantry that saw it describe it, is that he ran like clutching it like a rugby ball, and he kind of like swerves between some infantry having run out from behind a bush or a hut or whatever, and kind of like the infantry are kind of like, is that a Japanese guy? And there's clearly this moment of confusion where this guy's just sort of charged through them, and there's a moment where they were like, before they open fire, and so he dives underneath the tank and blows himself up. And there are 4 or 5 of these. At the end of the Battle of Oyin, and they sort of do a count up of the bodies. They always do this at the end of these battles. That's where we get the statistics in war diaries and so on. The good ones will record it. And generally speaking, the units in Burma are actually very professional. The Indian Army is a professional thing, and what it's expanded massively. What I find is the reports in Indian Army documents are brilliant, really, really detailed. And what they basically find is about 2/3 of all of the people were killed trying to rush tanks. Of the 150 or so Japanese that they kill, about a third of them, 50 of them, are outside of their foxholes charging with something that looks like an explosive bomb. So that when they then inspect them, they're picric acid, something that goes into explosives. And there are all sorts of quite horrible stories of them jumping under the tanks, getting caught up in the tracks as they're trying to set off the tank. Suicide bombs and things like that, and one of them, their arm gets stuck in the track mechanism whilst he's blowing himself up. Really, really grim stuff. But that's a real shock to them. But they do manage to push through this stuff. They do capture Oyen, and then they get to the actual town of Meiktila itself after a couple of days. They stop and they take on some. They capture an airfield called Tabukon. Take on some more reinforcements. One of the brigades, the infantry brigades, is flown in there, and then they actually attack the town itself. And then this is again one of those things we never ever think about in the Burma campaign. It is a vicious street fight. I said earlier, it's kind of like a semi-industrial European colonial settlement built around the transport links. It's a transport hub. So it has warehousing, it has mechanics equipment. Think of like the way you'd think of Stalingrad, the tractor factory, and all this sort of thing. This is the railway marshalling yards, the area where all of the trains are getting repaired. When you you'll see them in a garage where they have a pit underneath where you'll drive the car over and there's a pit underneath for the mechanics to work on. There are buildings like that, and they turn these things into bunkers and this sort of thing. And so it's real house to house, room to room fighting. It's not wooden villages like we always associate in the jungles. Although they are there on the peripheries, the kind of the suburbs of Meiktila are like that. The centre of the town isn't. And there's things like a hospital that they fortify, a jail that they fortify. The hospital's really grim, actually, because they just give the patients weapons and tell them to fight from their beds. So some of them stand up on their beds and shoot out the windows, and other people basically just can't, they can barely move, and they're told to kill themselves, although actually a lot of them don't, which is quite interesting. A lot of the prisoners they take in this period are hospital patients that basically couldn't fight back or didn't fight back. But they do have to go room. There's a Gurkha unit, the 1st and 10th Gurkhas, go room to room in the hospital. And for me, that's the kind of place where you set a horror film. Like a horror film set in the Second World War is Gurkhas going through like a hospital and then a jail, like one arc. They were next door to each other in the west side of the town. So it's really, really grim, and you get a couple of Victoria Crosses, which is unusual in victories. That it's one of those strange sort of quirks. That Rorke's Drift is a defensive last stand that is a success, but it's a big last stand. Kohima is a big last stand, but Arnhem, where there's a few Victoria Crosses, that's a failure that is also a last stand. Meiktila is none of those things. It's neither a last stand or a thing. It's a great victory. They capture this really difficult to capture town in a few days, but 2 Victoria Crosses. And one of them is a guy called Fazal Din, who gets stabbed by a samurai sword through the chest. Reports say it came out of his back. The point came out of his back, so he's literally run through. He pulls it out, kills the Japanese officer and another guy attacking another Indian soldier, and then reports back and dies later that night in the aid post. The other guy, William Weston, he, as he's charging a bunker, he's killed as he gets to it. And instead of rolling into cover and maybe waiting to get rescued, he doesn't want anyone else to be hit. So he takes a grenade off his webbing, rolls inside, and blows himself up. He's a 21-year-old kid. It's just incredible. So those 2 Victoria Crosses, one after the other, one day after the other. And we don't think of that with that. It's normally these, like I said, it's last stands, it's valiant defeats and all this sort of thing, not successful attacks through towns and cities. There are no Victoria Crosses. For example, there's one Victoria Cross at D-Day. You don't get one fighting through Con or anything like that. Okay, so yeah, I just found that really fascinating thing to sort of think about. And eventually, it is just tooth and nail fight through until they capture that town. But obviously, then they've got to hold it in the following.
And those stories, particularly William Weston's one, were just absolutely incredible. Because it told a story. Yeah, it told a story about the camaraderie, the esprit de corps in those armies and those units, because it's not something we traditionally think of when we're thinking of Burma. We're thinking of insurgency style fighting, guerrilla style fighting in the forests, not these kind of town pitch battles. they've captured it in a couple of days. And you said the Japanese know that they need this town. It's so important with the railway and the logistics links. How do the Japanese turn this their kind of style fighting into this siege fighting? Because it becomes incredibly brutal from this point when the Japanese are trying to take it back.
Yeah. So the next phase, the Japanese send their reinforcements. We mentioned the 49th Division from the south, the 18th from the north. So they're trying to squeeze it from two sides, basically. And what they're doing is the Japanese have a doctrine where you want to strike against your enemy before they get a chance to sort of dig in and settle. You want to hit them when they're unsettled. Not unlike the German army are very, very similar. You always counterattack as soon as you can. The enemy is always at their weakest when they first captured an objective. The problem is that the Allied, the Thunder Run, the 17th Indian Division, the 255th Indian Tank Brigade, knew that this was going to happen. And so this has all been planned into the operation. When the siege begins, they know they're going to be sieged. And a really interesting thing, when you look at the Japanese documents, and again, I talk about this in the book, they say things like, "Oh, we've recaptured Tabukon airfield." And it's like, well, no, guy, calm down. The Thunder Run was never going to keep that airfield. Once they've captured Meiktila and the airfield at Meiktila itself, they abandon that airfield. The Japanese say, we've completed the encirclement, we capture the road, like we set up a block on the road back to the Irrawaddy. So we've cut them off. No, that's never the point. This is not about capturing territory. This is a battle of annihilation that the Japanese don't yet know about, but the British and the Indian troops absolutely do. They are not here to capture this because we really want this town. We're here to capture it because we know you'll come to us. And remember, and going back to the very beginning, the whole point of this operation, remember, is to destroy the Japanese on that desert dry belt before they have to go to Rangoon, where it becomes jungly to the south, which will give all the advantages to the Japanese. If the Japanese were really clever here, they'd have been like, oh, we need to get back into the jungles, retreat south, get around Meiktila, and then build a new defensive line. Okay, and they've not done that. Okay, which would have been really difficult. I'm not saying that was really necessarily a likely thing to do, and I think psychologically that's not a likely thing to do, but it would have been an operationally prudent thing to do, perhaps. But I don't think it's really in their psychology to have done that. But what happens is so they want to strike back before they do, and this is playing exactly into Slim's hands. Okay, because they're being destroyed up at Mandalay, which is a separate story really to what I'm telling here, but it's part of it tangentially or peripherally. And they're trying to destroy the Japanese at Meiktila by using Meiktila as another one of these honeypots. Like you say, they know they need to capture it back. So they're trying to surround it from two sides. They think they're surrounding it. But this is all completely into Slim's hands. And in particular, the guy we need to focus on now really is a guy called David Punch Cowan. Now, he's the commander of the 17th Indian Division and is the commander of this entire garrison within Meiktila. And it's his battle, really, from the Thunder Run onwards. Mesavie has unleashed him. Slim has given Mesavie the job of doing this. It's Cowan that is actually he's Johnny on the spot doing the fighting. And his entire plan with Slim and Mesavie's sort of instruction, consent, whatever, okay, that as a team they have planned this. They are going to use columns of tanks, and this is really where the tagline to the book comes in, the greatest combined arms maneuver warfare battle. They're going to use armoured columns of tanks, mechanized infantry using lorries, carriers, riding on the backs of the Shermans a lot of the time. So for any model makers, this is also something really cool because you get to make models of like Gurkhas climbed on the back of Shermans and all stuff like that. So I mean, it would make a great film as well, not very funny. You've got these guys riding on the backs of their tanks into battle. They've got armoured cars going out on sweeps in the mornings to identify where the Japanese have arrived. And remember, the Japanese are arriving and immediately attacking. So they're deliberately kind of penny packeting themselves, which also, as we'll see in a moment, will lend itself to the British tactics and Indian tactics. So you've got a column of tanks, infantry on the back of them or in lorries, carriers, whatever. You've also got some self-propelled artillery, so 105mm Priest self-propelled guns. And one of my favourite guys I follow in the book is one of the guys that's an observer for these tanks, a guy called Nicky McClintock. He's brilliant. They go charging about on the desert in 6 different directions because they're surrounded, so they can go in any direction and they'll find some Japanese. They're doing this, though, with all this firepower. They've also got things like the RAF have got jeeps with them called Visual Control Post jeeps, VCP jeeps. And they're calling in aerial support, close air support. It's a thoroughly modern battle, this. It's really quite important to state that. So you're talking about maybe a squadron of tanks, So then a battalion of infantry and a troop of artillery on these self-propelled artillery, plus a few aircraft on the radio, on the end of the radio. They go to wherever they've identified the Japanese in a village, and then they just clear the village. And then by the afternoon, they withdraw back to their defensive boxes inside Meiktila. And the Japanese are like, we've recaptured this village. No, they haven't. No, the British and Indian troops have no intention of capturing that village. They're going into the village and clearing it to destroy the Japanese that arrived there overnight. And then they withdraw. Okay? And then a couple of days later, when another unit of the Japanese have come back, the Japanese will report, we captured so-and-so village. And the British come back, they kill another 100 Japanese, they capture another couple of guns, destroy another couple of guns. The big thing really that they have trouble here, the big problem is, I mentioned earlier this thing called Naganuma Force, this heavy artillery that was brought down, 15th Army's extra artillery assigned to this operation. The Japanese, from the very beginning of the war, have understood to a degree Allied air power, and they're very good at movement and concealment of their artillery, and they're good at sort of dispersing it enough for their safety, but not so much that they remove the concentration of force. I mean, they are not as concentrated as Allied artillery. That's an important thing there. But the rolling hills and broken gullies, dried up rivers from thousands of years ago that have now become these sort of little gullies and so on, sort of the scrub lands within these things that have grown up in the bottom of these dried up riverbeds and so on. They're able to move and conceal their artillery really well. So a lot of the sweeps to the north of the town, where Naganuma Force is based, are really hunting that artillery. And there's people like another guy I follow in the book called Jack Scollin. He's flying around in a little light aircraft, spotting for artillery as well. And he kind of gets semi-obsessed with hunting these guns. Like he's dueling them because he's radioing his artillery to attack their artillery. This guy, Jack Scollin, by the way, he's got an unpublished memoir in the Imperial War Museum. It's never seen the light of day. 500 odd pages. And it's about his experience as an observer against the Italians in North Africa, the Germans in Italy, and against the Japanese in Burma. I'm desperate to try and persuade the Imperial War Museum to let me edit that and release that if I can, because it's such a good book, and he's got such a wonderful insight on fighting the Italians, the Germans, and the Japanese. And he talks about the differences in them, like the Japanese dispersal. But also the way that the Japanese were more relentless. When the Italians and the Germans would shell, he said that they were horribly concentrated. But after 20 minutes, it's over. The Japanese, it's a slower pace, but it's all day. And the important thing is, I'm talking about the sweeps that go charging out in every direction. If anyone's read George MacDonald Fraser's Quartered Safe Out Here, he describes this, although he's not the perfect eyewitness, because there is evidence. There are people in his unit that I've also managed to find their eyewitness testimony, and they kind of say that he puts himself in the centre of the action when actually he wasn't. Not necessarily wrong what he's saying happened, it's just that he wasn't always the guy doing the thing he says he's doing. And he's on the edges of some of the things that happen rather than in them. But he's talking about all these kind of sweeps. But if you're one of the people on the inside, you're an artilleryman, you're one of the people that's working, getting the supplies off the airfield to the frontline units. You're the commanders. One of the other guys I follow in the book, he's chief of staff to Punch Cowan, because Cowan died not 10 years after the war. He never wrote a memoir or anything like that. He never really left much behind, sort of publicly at least, that's easily accessible. So this guy, Hugh Pettigrew, he did write an unpublished memoir that I managed to get hold of through the family. Podcast partner Rob Lyman, he managed to get that. He wrote this memoir, and it's so fascinating about following Cowan as his chief of staff. But people like him, the medical services, their experience of the Battle of Meiktila is almost First World War, not trench warfare because it's not trenches, but the constant artillery fire of the First World War. Slit trenches being dug, and you're spending half your days basically hiding from artillery. They're digging into the Japanese bunker basements of all the buildings, emptying all the bodies out and turning those into that thing. So there's a slightly subterranean existence for a lot of them. It also means that there are quite a lot of wounded who get re-wounded waiting for evacuation, because supply drops come in, supply aircraft fly in, and then wounded are taken out throughout this battle. And some people even go out and come back, because we're talking 6 weeks. That's the other thing we've not mentioned. The British unit here is 5 weeks, actually. They are surrounded at Meiktila for 5 weeks. Arnhem was supposed to be 2 days and it ended up at 9. This is 5 weeks, and that's the plan. To be there this long. So yeah, it's an amazing operation, but it's not just the sweeps, it's the experience back inside Meiktila as well. Because I try to give you some idea of what it's like in multiple different stories, not just the front line. I mean, they're all front line if they're surrounded, but like not just the guys going out on the sweeps. But that's the most dramatic part of it, I think, or the most fascinating part of it, these armoured sweeps charging out across the desert. And again, it's just, there's a constant relentless attrition to the Japanese who don't really work out what's going on until it's too late. Because again, like I say, they keep thinking they recapture a village. They're completing the encirclement, whatever. The British return to their defensive boxes. It's like, yes, they didn't break back through to the Irrawaddy or whatever, to their friends. Not quite working out that that's actually the plan, and that them turning up is kind of the problem for them. Like I said, they probably couldn't do it psychologically, but they could have tried to withdraw south into the jungles, and that maybe would have been better for them. But we're into counterfactuals now, and I just don't think they would have done that. It's just against everything in the Japanese psyche.
Yeah, and it's certainly against everything that you've mentioned across the two books, because it does not seem in the Japanese psychology to give up per se, because how that might have been perceived. But what I did get from this is just the relentless brutality of the Japanese in trying to win this and trying to recapture Meiktila could have or would have been absolutely draining, but not just draining on the British and the Indian troops that are there, but draining on the Burmese people. And there's something that you mentioned, is that the Burmese people actually rise up against the Japanese. So how do they interact with the British? But how does this also play a part in helping defeat the Japanese forces?
Yeah, I mean, what's so fascinating about this is many of the Burmese people at Meiktila that help the British are the people who were at least sympathetic with the Japanese when they arrived. So when we think of Burma as an ethnically diverse place, the ethnic Burma people that the country was named after at the time, obviously, we should point out it is Myanmar today. But the ethnic Burmese who live in the central dry belt and down into the Irrawaddy Delta, so like the sort of the central part of Burma down to the south. And then the sides that supported the Allies consistently throughout the whole war are the periphery of the country, the border areas. So generally speaking, this is the hill tribes in the jungle areas. So the Karens, the Chins, crossing over into India as well, the Naga people, and so on. And there are other groups as well. This is just a couple that I'm mentioning. They tend to be either Muslim because they're on the border area with what's now Bangladesh, or you've got things like on the Chinese border, a lot of the people there, like the Shans, Kachins, Karens, who have had, since the late Victorian period, American Baptist missionaries traveling around for decades and decades. And so they've become Baptist. And so what you then get is those areas generally stayed with the British throughout the war. And they will play a role at the end of this bit. I know how long I go on sometimes, Jackson. But the Burmas in the centre of the country, they, like I said, were the most anti-British. They're the people that had been the ruling class before the British arrived, and now they're colonially subjugated. And so that's what they want to go back to. And that's within a couple of generations, 1880s, the British arrive in there. This is not a place that's been British for hundreds of years. It's about 70 years that we're talking they've been British Empire. And so the Burmese people are not that keen on the British in 1942, to put it lightly, put it mildly. But by 1945, like I said earlier, they have changed sides, effectively. Now, there's a couple of ways this comes out. Firstly, another guy I follow in this is a guy called Donald Maitland, who's an amazing character. Some maybe older listeners who are very into their 1970s politics, which can't be that many, but there must be some. They might remember him as having worked for Ted Heath in Downing Street and also been the British ambassador to the United Nations in the 70s, Donald Maitland. Well, he was an intelligence officer in his early 20s in the 17th Indian Division, fighting at Meiktila. And what he's doing is he's learned Burmese. He goes on to learn Arabic as well, and that's how he gets into his diplomatic career later. But he learns to speak Burmese, and he becomes basically the centre of gathering intelligence and processing intelligence. So I mentioned earlier the armoured cars going and identifying the Japanese. He's kind of processing a lot of that information. But the big thing he's doing is he is basically setting up little centres with sort of what are effectively making it known that he has food, cigarettes, cloth to make long yis, the traditional sort of Burmese, almost like a long sarong that both men and women wear. Very colourful, very very beautiful things actually. He's bringing all these sort of supplies in, um, so that he can persuade Burmese people to basically come and tell him where the Japanese are. And he does not struggle to find sources. One of the interesting things when he first arrives is on that first day, they literally spend about 12 hours interviewing locals all day. It's not just him, it's a team of them, about half a dozen, of locals coming in and saying, yeah, the Japanese are going here on that place. We saw them carrying this thing. And then they're talking about ordnance, weapons, reinforcements, where they're going to, where they're arriving. And they're coming in the mornings, basically just grassing on the Japanese as to where they are. And and this is a big part of the intelligence picture that is then where the armoured sweeps are then sent to when they go out. So, this whole system has been really thought through by the Allies here. So that's sort of the first way that it happens. But he also begins to hear intelligence about the leadership of the Burmese National Army, but also the Indian National Army. At one point, he's on the tail of Subhash Chandra Bose. He gets information about his whereabouts. But also the leader of the Burma National Army, a guy called Aung San, who, again, the complications of the time, he's one of the guys that's leading the Burmese against the British in 1942. He's been to Japan before. Like, he is the arch enemy of the British in 1942. Okay, but he's changed sides. Now, the Japanese don't know this at the beginning, but Donald Maitland is one of the people. He's the one person in Meiktila that is key to this. But it should be said is that this knowledge is also known outside through other channels to Slim, Mesavie, and so on. It's not an exclusively Maitland story, this particular bit, but it's very important to this the wider story here. Is that they get wind that he's willing to change sides. Now, he's based down in Rangoon with about a division just under a couple of brigades, so not quite 10,000 men down in Rangoon. The Japanese don't really trust them because they don't really trust anyone that isn't Japanese, to be honest. Like, completely trust them. And he does a parade in front of the Japanese in Rangoon, and basically says, "We are off to the front to fight." And conveniently doesn't say who, and he marches north and then just hands himself over to the British, and then they take part in the rest of the conquest, sort of April and May 1945. And the Japanese are like, "Yeah, jolly well done, off." And the British are like, "Yes, thanks very much." And they take part in sort of the guerrilla fighting and that sort of thing, sort of before the Japanese surrender in August. But it's interesting for Maitland back in Meiktila, because what they start getting is the people that are part of that uprising across the country, the cells, if you see what I mean. They are all keen to persuade Cowan to let them do some fighting, and they allow them to have a couple of test fights. So they send them out with some British stiffeners to see what they can get up to, and that sort of thing. And so a small number of them do take part in the sort of the Battle of Meiktila. But they have a much bigger sort of role in the race to Rangoon, sort of once the fighting over the airfield is finished and that sort of. There's sort of multiple different things. The last thing as well to do with the sort of the race to Rangoon, I'll quickly mention this now before we do the airfield perhaps, but SOE has been setting up, Force 136 is the formal name of it. They've been setting up cells across Burma for all of this as well throughout this period. Not part of this battle directly because it predates it by a couple of years they've been doing this. But it's important here because they also help with getting to Rangoon. And the thing that's often forgotten, these groups of SOE, Force 136, sorry, in the race to Rangoon period, they destroy, and I know it's really sort of like grim saying destroy, but they destroy about a Japanese division worth of Japanese soldiers in that race to Rangoon. And realistically, getting to Rangoon by May is at least 50% about the Force 136 groups sort of kind of doing all of this work, sowing complete disruption and chaos in the Japanese rear, just at the point when they're desperate to reorganize. And obviously, reorganizing on the retreat is about the rear areas getting control, getting a grip, and they just can't. Now, I'm massively simplifying a story there of what Force 136 does, but they are really, really important to the breakout after the Meiktila battle is over.
And it's really interesting hearing all these different elements that they have to control and run, with the ethnic diversity and the religious diversity around the fringes, what these different groups and people are all doing at the same time to ensure that the British can to have a proper run at Rangoon before the monsoon season arrives. There's so many different factors, and it is a crying shame that Slim is not considered in the kind of same category, and some of these other commanders are not considered in the same category as Monty or Eisenhower and so on, because they do have to, the cognitive ability to think about so many different factors at that point is just ridiculous.
It's interesting what you say there, though, about Slim, because he is kind of the thinking man's choice. I think a lot of people who know a lot about the Second World War would say he's probably the best British commander. But for the more general public, Monty is the guy they think of. And I'm not a complete Monty hater, but I'm also very aware of his flaws and things like that. Whereas Slim really is, honestly, I'm not an objective observer, I guess. He is, to me, the best commander of the Second World War. My argument for that would be is the sheer amount of changes he has to go through. There's in the Second World War, 1942, he has to dust off his troops. He gets superseded by other commanders first, but ultimately he's kind of part of behind getting them back home, the rebuilding of them, and in particular it's his changes when he does take over at the end of 1943 that turns the Indian Army around. But then in 1944, he has to turn them around again from being like a jungle warfare thing, fighting with air power and mule transport, to being the modern mechanized maneuver warfare of 1945. And no other British, Indian, whatever army goes through so many transitions in the 2 years from 1943 to 1945 that Slim does. I mean, rewind that even slightly further. In 1940, the Indian Army is being prepared to fight the Germans and Italians in North Africa. So it's mechanized early warfare before sort of modern mechanized maneuver warfare has been kind of properly created. With the 3D battlefield and all these things, that's all still in its infancy. And they're certainly not armoured in 1940. There's no actual Indian armoured divisions. There are some on paper, but there are no Indian armoured divisions. They're all infantry divisions that are mechanised for the desert in 1940. They're the ones that then get bullied in 1942, to put it as simply as possible, for the sake of the fact this isn't a 42 podcast. And then that's turned into the jungle warfare machine of late 1943, but in particular 1944. And then that's then flipped round into the modern mechanised manoeuvre, armour warfare that we now recognise, that became really the NATO standard in the rest of the 20th century and really up to the modern day. And Slim does that 3 times. So he's kind of there for those 3 changes, pushing through at least 2 of them, and really all 3 of them. Well, yeah, 2 of them. And so he's completely forgotten from the stories to just how important he is. And the other thing as well is his legacy is often what happens at Imphal and Kohima. It absolutely should be the liberation of Burma, the reconquest of Burma, because the deception operations, the manoeuvre warfare, the crossing of the Irrawaddy, which again we skipped over in a few moments, is another amazing operation. And that's really what he should be remembered for, more so than anything else. And then, like you said, the other commanders, Punch Cowan, he's one of the best divisional commanders of the war. Pete Ree's not directly part of this, but he's the guy at Mandalay. He's one of the best. I'd love to have seen some of these divisional commanders in Europe, because there are some absolute donkeys that fight in Europe, whereas these guys are absolutely brilliant. He has fought in the West, and he's got it wrong, but that's partly because he constantly puts his HQ too far forward, and his problem is his HQ gets attacked twice. Once is never, twice is always. But at the end of the day, he does ultimately become a really, really effective commander. And we should say about Cowan as well. Cowan is one of a couple of people earmarked to be in charge of the Commonwealth Corps that was going to be part of the invasion of Japan before the atomic bombings happened. Cowan was sent home to rest, because one of the awful things that happens to him, his son is killed fighting at Mandalay whilst he's fighting at Meiktila, and he basically has a day off in a weird way. But then he's given some rest after this operation, but he is expected to then be fighting against the Japanese in Japan with the Commonwealth Corps. I should say this is really tangential, but the Commonwealth Corps, I think, has disaster written all over it. If they'd invaded Japan, there was going to be a British, an Australian and a Canadian division each in this corps to take part in Operation Downfall. Not on the initial waves, they were part of the reinforcing waves because of how bad the casualties were. They were expecting, huge casualties. None of those 3 divisions had faced the Japanese, and I think that has disaster written all over it. They should have been using, in my opinion, should have been using, if they didn't want to use Indian Army divisions, which we know that MacArthur did not, because MacArthur was obviously really part of the planning for this. He didn't want Indian divisions in this early. The other thing about the Commonwealth Corps, by the way, they were going to go to America, do some training in America, and be equipped with American uniforms, helmets, everything, American weapons. They'd then be under British command in the Commonwealth Corps, but they would have looked in the newsreel and photographs, important point with MacArthur, they would have looked like Americans. you wouldn't have had Brody helmets and the Enfields in Japan, basically, in that period anyway. The Indian Army was eventually going to follow after Malaya and Singapore had been captured, and sort of, like, I'm talking like a year later, because of the assumptions about how long the reconquest of Japan, or the conquest of Japan, was going to be. Indian Army units would eventually have got there. I think it would have been a disaster, though, if they hadn't brought in some of those earlier. So it's a good thing it didn't happen, to be honest. But Cowan was earmarked for that, so he was respected to that degree that they were going to allow an Indian Army officer. He was a Gurkha originally, a Gurkha officer. He's British. He was a British officer in the Gurkhas when he was a 21-year-old subaltern. To have commanded an Australian, Canadian, and British division is a big step that his name was in that. There were two other names that were mentioned, but he was one of them. So that would have been a big step. But I think soldiers that have never fought the Japanese invading Japan has disaster written all over.
Yeah, and I certainly think, or hope, that you write that book as well about the potential disaster.
Yeah, that would be brilliant.
Japanese invasion. Now, obviously,
maybe
I
there's
think
a fiction book in that.
Oh, that would be awesome. That would be incredible. Jack, we've spoken about so much of this Thunder Run, Meiktila. We've spoken about parts of Mandalay, and we obviously have to leave something on the plate for everyone to go and get a copy of your book. But first, we've got the final fun questions we do for all guests, and you've had one a couple of times before.
Yeah.
Me and you have been talking about watches a lot recently. What type of watches are you most interested in?
So we both nerded out at this, didn't we, at the Imperial War Museum? So I'll keep this as short as I can. I recently, when I was trying to find a dress watch I was invited to go to the VJ Day event at the National Memorial Arboretum, which was very, very kind by Bill Slim's grandson, Lord Mark Slim. So that was very, very kind of him. And the Burma Star Memorial Fund sort of arranged it. But basically, I needed a dress watch because I didn't really have anything properly dressy. And so I had to... I started looking. I just didn't like any modern ones, so I started buying Soviet watches. They have, I'm not interested if it's after the Soviet Union collapsed, because they make interesting and different ones and things like that. I don't want a modern Russian watch. It's got to be a Soviet watch. You're big into your Cold War. I taught Cold War at my school. My other job, I'm a bit croaky because I've been on a school trip for 3 days with 170 year sevens before we recorded. But when I was on this trip, because I'm a teacher. It's that thing where I have taught the Cold War and things like that. So that sort of link came in because they're just different, and you have a couple. That's why we nerded out, because they're cool, they're different. They do something different to what European watchmakers do.
Yeah, cool faces, cool styles. I mean, I think that's a great answer, and I was going to love that answer anyway.
Yeah.
Obviously, people are going to want to learn about the airfield. They're going to want to learn about the beginnings of the run to Rangoon. Where can people get Thunder Run, Meiktila 1945?
The most obvious place it will come out would be that it's available on is Amazon website. And it is on Kindle as well as hardback. There'll be a paperback next year at some point. But you can get it there, but it's on other websites, Waterstones, for example. But if you really want to support any author, the best thing is to buy it from their publisher. So Chiselbury, so chiselbury.co.uk. Just Google Thunder on Chiselbury or Thunder on Jack Bowsher. The website will come up. But yeah, if you buy it from those sort of sources, that's the best way to support any author. So yeah, thank you.
Certainly encourage anyone getting a copy of this book along with Forgotten Armour, because it does link up the story really nicely. And then obviously, Jack, there are other ways to stay involved with you and your work and keep up to date with what you're doing in between. So where can people keep up to date with you and with the podcast that you do that you mentioned earlier?
Yes. So my social media handle on basically everything is @HistoryBowsh. My nickname at school with the kids is Bowsh or Big Bowsh. So @HistoryBowsh. Like I said, all of my social media, Facebook as well, you can just find me as Jack Bowsher. The other project, though, that I do, so yeah, thanks for bringing it up as well, Jackson. So I do the Forgotten War podcast, Burma Campaign World War II. So just the Forgotten War pod is really what we call it. But it's myself and Rob Lyman. So obviously he's probably the name in the Burma campaign. And we started about a year ago, basically, and we've done Series 1. We just did a very quick 11 episodes doing an overview of the Burma campaign from quite a high level. So everyone had the basic timeline. But then now what we're doing is each subsequent series, we've just finished Series 2, we're doing the whole campaign in a lot of detail. So we've just done 21 episodes, or 20 episodes plus Q&A on 1942 only. And we're still going to do some more 1942 in Series 3. And yeah, we'll just crack on through the war for as long as it takes. at the moment chronologically, and then maybe if we finish, we'll go back and we'll fill in any gaps and things like that. But no, we've had a really good fun doing it. Lots of interviews. We've done book reviews. We've had some really cool names. I mean, series 2 we started with a bang because we had Bill Slim's grandson on. We're involved with a couple of different charities as well through that. Literally tomorrow's episode, which will be a couple of weeks ago by the time people listen to this, but we had Alex Bescaby and Levison Wood's brilliant documentary, The Last Burma Star, which you can still get on Sky History because it's only a couple of weeks ago. So if you want to watch that, we're very keen supporters of Alex Bescaby's work on the Burma campaign in particular because he's done a few different documentaries. So yeah, he's sort of a friend of our show.
I know it's a great podcast, and I haven't seen you guys obviously you and Lucy at IWM across that day. It's a really good thing to be shining some light on this particular conflict. My great granddad was over there in the RAF, so I absolutely love that you're shining light on Burma. So thank you very much, Jack, and
yeah,
look forward to having you again.
That's the big. Yeah, thank you, mate. That's the big thing for us is we the big objective ultimately is by hook or by crook, and even if it takes years, we want to try and make the Burma campaign part of the mainstream story of the Second World War. Because at the moment it isn't. We understand and appreciate that it is not part of the mainstream story. We want it to be. The other thing as well is that it's such a fantastic story. Now this the Thunder Run, Meiktila 1945, the book, is just such a fascinating story, and I put this to some other people as well. It's like Blitzkrieg adjacent, but it's better. That's what I want people to take from it. It's just such a good story, and we don't think of the Burma campaign being like that. We always think that it's people slogging through monsoon and jungle, and it's not. It's a combined arms maneuver battle, tanks charging across the desert with their infantry, Indians, Gherkins, Brits on the back. To be honest, it's a close run thing at times, but they do absolutely smash the Japanese in the end. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. And thank you again for having me back on, Jackson. Cheers.
No worries, mate. Thank you very much.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast.